Today, I'm going to be doing the exceptionally brave thing of talking about games journalism, game journalists. This popped up on my Twitter timeline. There's no stories about game reviewers getting paid by publishers in the press, but in the influencer/YouTube world, it's alarmingly common. Even I get emails from publishers asking to pay me to review their new game, yet somehow the wider narrative is YouTubers good, critics bad. And this is in response to another tweet by Jacob Geller, who I do believe makes videos on YouTube and is widely well received, talking about game critics versus YouTubers. And I just want to address this topic because obviously somebody who does YouTube, and I do just want to say on one minor nitpicking detail here, yes, YouTubers do get emails from publishers asking to pay to review a game, but that doesn't mean they're paying you to give the game a good review. They're not the same thing. I've had companies before, such as Owlcat Games, is it? They make the Pathfinder series. They wanted me to do a video on the game, and what they did was they said, play the game, tell people about it, whatever you think of it. Paid me, made the video. Cool. Now, you can definitely argue that there's some incentive there to be positive, but while they're going to pay you either way, you have a contract in place that stipulates so, and you can publish whatever you want, and there's no guidelines. I'm failing to see how that would be different than, for instance, you as a games journalist who work for a large publication where the publication buys ads on your website, and that's how your website survives, is your editor or the person who runs the website going to agree that you can give a Sony game a 3 out of 10 and say it's absolute critical garbage? Probably not, right? People have lost their job for that before in the games industry, in game journalism. But obviously we can go into detail on that later. Jacob Geller's tweets, he says here, I still occasionally have people tell me that game critics are paid by publishers for good reviews, and it's just like, do you know how huge it'd be to break that story? True. To be the site that reveals the cash payouts everyone is taking and no one has spilled the beans. I think this is a bit of a straw man, to be honest, because when most people say that game critics are being paid by publishers for good reviews, I don't know that anybody means game publishers are saying, hey you, IGN, Kotaku, Polygon, whatever else, here's 10 grand, give us a good review. I don't think anybody believes that that's happening. Then again, that's wrong. Some people believe that's happening because some people are not engaging in reality whatsoever. What I do think people believe is happening, and what I believe is happening, is that, again, like I've just said, you as a publication have every incentive to work well with certain companies. Because if you don't work well with a company, if you don't, toe the party line, so to speak, what happens is you get blacklisted, maybe not even explicitly. Maybe they don't explicitly say, we're not going to send you keys anymore for early access of games to get your review in, which you rely on to generate clicks on your website. Because, for instance, if one website has our early impressions of this game and you don't, do you think you're going to get many clicks for coverage of that game compared to the other website? Of course you're not. Common sense. So obviously you rely on things like this. Exclusive interviews, exclusive access to break trailers, exclusive access to information, information drops and things like that. And then, of course, the keys for the games to play. Plus, a lot of these publications get to, mingle with the executives at these companies, go to dinners, go to events with these people. So if you think all of that there's no conversation we can have about the corporate structure and power that comes from being involved with these big companies, these big publishers, and whether that would impact what you can or can't say, or whether or not you even in your head would put that forward to an editor and say, this is my review, and reduce it down to, oh, they're not actually giving us cash. And that's ridiculous that anybody would ever think that. I'm just not engaging with that as being, what people are actually saying. But also, of course, if this was going on, if publishers were saying, here's 10 grand, make us a good review, that would obviously come out. And he does go on to say every game announcement and even internal communication is routinely leaked, and yet everyone has kept their mouth totally fucking shut on this. It's like people who think the Illuminati exist and thousands of celebrities are perfectly good at keeping the secret. Again, I don't believe that people, by and large, think this way. I think when most people say game journalists are being paid by the companies, the big publishers, to give good reviews, they're saying it because of what I've just explained, not because they think actual backhand cash payments under the table are going on. Somebody brings up this. Apparently PewDiePie has been paid and other YouTubers by Warner Bros. For positive game reviews. I don't know anything about that. I'm not going to go into detail on it because it's irrelevant in my opinion. Obviously the point gets brought up, and is the point here. This is a story about YouTubers, a group of people repeatedly tell me are more trustworthy than journalists. I'm not sure why YouTubers is a group, because there's many different YouTubers, lots of them, I would say, from small to big, and anyone who treats it as like one voice, like some type of Borg shit, they're not engaging with the point. I think this is a complete straw man. Contextually, you can understand if anyone says YouTubers are more trustworthy than games journalists. They're talking about the YouTubers that they think are trustworthy, not literally every YouTuber. So if some bad apples, do take payments for things, and then you use that as an example, then let's use examples of when game journalists do things that are bad, and then treat you all exactly the same, because that's what you're doing. The YouTubers get paid for shit all the time because they have no ethics or journalistic standards, and yet that's never who people talk shit about. Completely straw man, untrue. I'm a YouTuber. My comment sections, people talk shit about me. You're talking shit about us now as a games journalist, and also I believe you're a YouTuber as well. So it's just not true. People talk shit about YouTubers all the time, just like they talk shit about games journalists all the time. But obviously, when you want to start getting into topics such as like, why do people not like games journalists, it's real simple, it's real easy. And again, let's treat games journalists as a homogenous group as opposed to individuals who do bad things like this. We've seen over the years games journalists routinely publish articles that make it seem like they actually hate gamers and they hate games, which is going to win you absolutely no goodwill whatsoever within the community of gamers, because gamers play games, they love games, they want people to talk about games that they like, or at least break stories or talk about things that are important to their life. But when games journalists seem to have an actual, real dislike for the people they're writing for, which is what you're doing as a games journalist, you're not writing for other journalists, although you do typically tend to treat it like that. You're writing for gamers, and when you show that you dislike gamers with the things that you say that gamers are about, obviously they're not going to like you. So yeah, of course they're probably going to side with a YouTuber who represents their values and what they like and what they think within gaming. Also, what you'll tend to find is that a publication will have a certain person review a game when that person perhaps doesn't even like the genre of game they're reviewing, or isn't very experienced in doing so with games that have gone back in the series or back in the genre. But for instance, if you're reviewing an ARPG, you should be a lifetime ARPG fan, because if you're not, your opinion's not all that relevant unless you're looking at it from a complete casual standpoint of somebody who's just coming into the genre. So obviously your opinion is going to be dismissed by a lot of people who know what they're talking about and have played these types of games for a long time. But then the problem is that publication has that review by that one person, and that's what they use as coverage of the game. There's also, as we've seen many, many times, a massive disparity between reviews of games journalists and reviews of the general, wider population. They're not exactly the same. They don't line up one-to-one all the time. Sometimes one group's nitpicking. Sometimes one group is boycotting or, review bombing. So it's not exactly like something you can put a finger on. But there are definitely examples of this where certain games got a whole bunch of game journalist ire for very little. Cyberpunk 2077 comes to mind, a game that came out. Hogwarts Legacy, of course, is one that's been reviewing well, but there has been a lot of unnecessary messaging around it, such as the headlines of, Hogwarts Legacy might be a good game, but it doesn't deserve to be reviewed as a game. That's coming from game journalists, not from YouTubers. by and large, I guess. And I'm not going to get into the whole topic of why that is. But we obviously know that that's going to be something that's going to annoy gamers, which again is going to back up the point of why gamers would typically not like games journalists. Of course, going into that as well, games journalists, for games journalism, it's a job. You train as a journalist and then you get into games journalism. It's a stepping stone usually before they get into the world of what they want to do, which a lot of the times nowadays is politics, which is another topic. Games journalists typically, not all of them of course, tend to review games or even tech with politics involved, and almost nobody wants to read that. They think it's actually, a lot of people play games to get away from the real world, and then the real world gets brought into games, even in ways that are, completely unrelated. We can remember back to when the PS5 came out, and some of the, I think it was a Kotaku article. Here you go. Here's the article. But does it really matter when discussing the PS5? This review has spent 3,000 words talking about the PlayStation 5, which is the most I've written about anything. Well, that's good, because it's the PlayStation 5 article. It's as good a video game console as there has ever been. The combination of ultra-high definition video, increases frame rates, high-end graphics techniques like ray tracing, the lightning-fast SSD, make it feel like a real-deal next-gen successor to the PlayStation 4. And if you're not ready to give up on the previous console, the PlayStation 5 reliably runs a vast majority of the PlayStation 4 library, with many of those games receiving upgrades to fidelity, frame rate, and loading times. Amazing review so far. PS5's great, but I'd be remiss to ignore all the reasons not to be excited for the PlayStation 5. The world is still reeling under the weight of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. There are more Americans at work now than at any point in the country's history, with no relief in sight. Our healthcare system is an inherently evil institution that forces people to ration life-saving medication like insulin and choose the S word of taking your own life over suffering with untreated mental illness. As I'm writing this, it looks very likely that Joe Biden will be our next president, but it's clear that the worst people aren't going away just because a new old white man is sitting behind the Resolute desk. Well, at least not this old white man. Our government is fundamentally broken in a way that necessitates radical change rather than incremental electoralism. Now, of course, that's a review by a game journalist on a mainstream game publication about the PlayStation 5. And then you're going to wonder why people don't like mainstream game journalism and why they'd prefer YouTubers who just talk about video games, and the PlayStation 5's good? Okay, cool. I'll buy it or I won't buy it. Then when you look at YouTubers, a lot of YouTubers start talking about games because that's their passion, and they do it for no money. They do it without the hopes of making any money a lot of the time, and they usually do it for years and years without getting paid almost a penny for their time of doing so. They're doing it for the passion because they love games, and then they eventually, if they're good at it, they might just make a living from doing it. But the minute that they start doing things that gamers don't like, they probably won't have an audience anymore and won't have a job. Whereas it doesn't seem that that's the case with game journalists. You don't need to be passionate about games. You don't need to be a lifelong MMORPG player to review an MMO, apparently. You don't need to be a lifelong RPG player or a fighting game player to be a games journalist and then review or talk about those games, which obviously is pretty transparent for most people that a lot of games journalists are doing it for a job. Now, let's also talk about the fact that games journalism is not created equally. There are people, just like Jason Schreier, people like that are doing investigative work, breaking stories that are important and have real world consequences that people will care about, things going on in the industry that are bad. And then there's somebody writing a review for a single-player game that everyone's going to forget about in 6 months, and then maybe talking about some politics while they're doing it or some social issues. They're not created equally, are they? They're not the same thing. And I think most people doing game reviews as a journalist, they don't really use their ethics or journalistic standards whatsoever doing that anyway. So I'm not sure why that's exactly a point. You don't need to have ethics or journalistic standards to review a video game, at least in my opinion, as long as you're not getting paid, of course. And if you are getting paid under the table as a YouTuber, obviously you're a bad person and you should lose your job. It's against the terms of service on YouTube. It's against the law in most countries, and you should be fined and have your YouTube channel deleted. I completely agree with that. But to say it's a lot of people this is happening to, maybe a few years ago when it was a little bit more lax. Nowadays, I'd be very surprised if that was the case. And if it is, again, maybe as a games journalist, you should use your ethics and journalistic standards to find out who that is, publish it as a story, and get rid of the bad actors. We have another one here. I think a more truthful state for gaming journalism would be that sites are more hesitant to heavily pan bigger games. Inferior falling out of grace with the publishers, but that is more nuanced and less evident. Exactly what I was saying earlier, right? And then Gabe Gerwin, who says we, so I presume he's a games journalist, replies and said, "We seriously do not give a shit. You may not give a shit, but if, for instance, all the other publications gave Sony's new game a glowing review, even if it wasn't a really glowing game, and then your publication, written by you, says, I think this game was shit, do you think your editor's going to give a shit? Do you think that's going to get published? I don't think it is." And obviously, I'm being reductive in the language there. You could go into, a long essay about why you think it's a bad game. And you're not necessarily wrong if you are using the subjectivity of being a person who likes or dislikes something. But whether you give a shit as the person writing the article is completely irrelevant, realistically, because you're not the one who typically has final say if it goes out on these big publications. Now, we can talk about why some YouTubers do bad things, and it's obviously for specifically that reason. There's no barrier for entry. There's no degree. You don't need to be a journalist. You don't need to be anything else. But realistically, in most circumstances, you don't need most of that stuff if you're just reviewing games. On either side, I don't think you need a journalist degree to say whether a game's good and you like it or not, and what you like about it, other than being able to write or speak eloquently, or just to put your thoughts on paper in a way that makes somebody want to read it, or then you speak it and for people to listen. Everyone's got their own bias here in their brain. As a games journalist, you're probably going to be like, oh yeah, I get more shit than YouTubers do. You probably don't, because typically, even for a small YouTuber, you're probably getting way more comments than a moderately sized journalist is. I don't know what their numbers are per article, but I know for like a channel with a couple 100,000 subscribers, if you're putting out consistent content that's like on par with your subscriber number in terms of the views that they get per video, you're probably killing games journalists in terms of how many views you're getting. But I will just say that obviously if you're a games journalist, you probably don't have a personal connection to your audience whatsoever. People don't learn anything about you. They read your article on the main website. They probably don't even know it's by you or look at who you are. And then they just go away from the website. Whereas with YouTubers, they see them on camera, they hear their voice, it's much more personal. They're going to be way more likely to know, what does this YouTuber like? Does he like this type of game that I like? Does he dislike this type of game that I dislike? Are there things within this game that I agree with him that I like or dislike? And then obviously you can use that to later inform your opinion of, does this person align with me, and do I want to watch his reviews? Because obviously we've built up this rapport of what I know they're about, essentially, and how that aligns with what I'm about. Whereas with game journalism, you typically don't really have that unless you're making videos, which at that point, you're also a YouTuber. Also, again, going back to what people don't like about games journalists, it seems that a lot of the times they just aren't good at playing games, and it's not necessary to be like a savant, Fortnite pro, 700 APM StarCraft 2 professional GSL player or something. But when like reviews come out and somebody sat there, couldn't beat the tutorial of a game, and then everyone at the publication has seen that and they've still published that this person couldn't play the game, or people complaining about like things that they just didn't understand, that are very simple concepts within a game, that's not good journalism either. So if you're going to like group up YouTubers and say, oh, they're all bad people who are unethical and they all accept bribes and blah, 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 I don't think that's reality whatsoever. Just like I don't think it's reality that all publications are bad or doing bad things. I just think that obviously reducing the point down from like, there's actual legitimate concerns about any form of journalism that's reliant on money from the things they're reporting on. I don't think that's the same as, they're definitely, just giving you money under the table to do reviews, and treating it as such completely just destroys any form of conversation you can have, because you're reducing somebody's point down to a complete straw man. But there we go, that's me talking about games journalism, as if anyone really gives a fuck. But thank you very much for watching. See you next time, peace out.